Hello everyone, and welcome back to Echoes of Fear. I know many of you watch these videos to relax or fall asleep, so before you drift off, how about leaving a comment letting me know where you're watching from? If you're enjoying the case, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into the story. The Collector of Memories. Few things are as haunted as objects. Unlike people who leave visible marks on the world, objects don't speak, don't cry, don't ask for help, but they observe. They hold secrets. They carry stories that were never meant to be remembered. Now, imagine stepping into an antique shop. Among dusty shelves and glass cases filled with forgotten relics, you get the sense that every item has lived a life before reaching your hands. A chair may have been someone's favorite place to sit before they never came home. A ring may have sealed promises that were never kept. A mirror may have reflected things that should never have existed. And what if I told you that in a small town, forgotten by time, there was an antique store where the objects didn't just tell stories, but held the secrets of disappearances that were never solved? This is the story of Richard Langston, an ordinary man, the owner of a small antique shop. To him, every item sold was a way of preserving the past. But he never imagined that among the worn-out furniture and dusty trinkets, his store would become the center of a terrifying mystery. It all started with a mirror. It was large, framed in dark wood, with hand-carved details. At first glance, nothing about it seemed unusual, but Richard vividly remembered the man who had brought it in. A thin figure with sunken eyes, wrapped in a heavy coat despite the summer heat. He entered the shop without saying his name, without looking around. He simply placed the mirror on the counter and muttered, "It's better here than with me." Before Richard could ask any questions, the man had already stepped outside, disappearing down the empty street. The next day, something strange happened. A woman walked into the shop. She looked uneasy, her eyes scanning the room until they landed on the mirror. Instantly, her face went pale. "Where did you get that?" Her voice was low, almost a whisper. Richard frowned. "It came from a client. Is something wrong?" The woman was trembling from head to toe. Her eyes were wide, filled with a terror Richard couldn't understand. "That mirror. It belonged to my sister." Richard waited for her to continue. "My sister disappeared 2 years ago. That mirror was in her bedroom." The shop suddenly felt smaller, suffocating. A cold chill ran down Richard's spine, but he told himself it was just a coincidence, until it happened again. Days later, a man recognized an old music box covered in dust. He said it was identical to the one his mother had owned before she vanished without a trace. Weeks later, a young man pointed to an antique notebook and swore it belonged to his best friend, a college student who had been missing for months. One by one, the items in Richard's store started connecting to missing people. Objects from unknown victims, stories with no endings, memories with no owners. And the most disturbing part? They had all come from the same man. A man no one could describe clearly. The Collector of Memories. For the first time in years, Richard Langston felt uneasy in his own shop. He had always loved the quiet hum of his antique store, the way time seemed to slow down between the old wooden shelves and dusty glass cases. But now, every item around him felt different, as if they weren't just objects anymore, as if they were watching him. The discoveries came one after another. More customers recognizing belongings of missing loved ones. More stories of unexplained disappearances, all connected by the same pattern. Every single item had been sold to him by the same man. A man whose presence was always fleeting, his descriptions inconsistent. Some swore he was tall, others insisted he was short. Some claimed he was old, others thought he was barely past 30. Richard tried searching his sales records, but they told him nothing. The man had paid in cash. No name, no ID, no paper trail. It was then that Richard made a decision. He needed help. The detective Jonathan Reese had seen a lot in his years working homicide, but nothing quite like this. When Richard walked into the police station, carrying a notebook filled with dates, descriptions of objects, and the names of missing persons, Reese was skeptical at first. "So let me get this straight." The detective leaned forward, flipping through Richard's notes. "You're saying an unknown man has been selling you objects that belonged to people who vanished?" "Not just vanished, detective. Some of them were never found." Reese sighed, rubbing his temples. "Do you have any proof? Surveillance footage? A name?" "No name, no credit card transactions. But I do have something." Richard placed a small black box on Reese's desk. This music box belonged to Margaret Holloway. She disappeared in 2016. I found something inside it. The detective opened the lid and a soft, eerie melody filled the room. But it wasn't the song that made Reese's stomach tighten. It was the folded piece of paper hidden beneath the delicate gears. He carefully unfolded it. The note was old, the edges yellowed with time. The handwriting was messy, frantic. "He takes what we forget. He collects what we leave behind." Reese's eyes darkened. This was no longer just an antique shop mystery. The pattern. As the investigation progressed, Reese started to see the connections. Over the past decade, dozens of people had vanished under similar circumstances. Alone, late at night, no signs of struggle. The only thing they left behind were the objects now sitting in Richard's store. And then, there was the man, the collector. Every witness account of him contradicted the others. No one could recall his face. No cameras had ever captured him. It was as if he existed in the gaps of reality, slipping through unnoticed, leaving behind only the remnants of those he had taken. Reese's instincts told him one thing. This wasn't just a coincidence. This was deliberate. Someone, something, was collecting more than just objects. And if they didn't stop him soon, more would disappear. The stakeout. Richard agreed to a plan. The next time the collector came to sell an item, Reese and his team would be waiting. For days, Richard worked in his shop as if nothing had changed, but his pulse quickened every time the bell above the door jingled. Each night, he locked up faster than usual, the air thick with an unshakable tension. And then, one evening, it happened. The door creaked open. A shadow stretched across the wooden floor. Richard felt his breath hitch as the man stepped inside. A long coat, sunken eyes, a presence that seemed to warp the very air around him. The collector placed a small wooden box on the counter, his fingers tapping lightly against the polished surface. "This one is special," he murmured. His voice was quiet, almost distant. Richard swallowed hard, nodding as he discreetly pressed the silent alarm beneath the counter. Seconds later, the door burst open. Reese and two officers stormed in, guns drawn. "Hands where I can see them," the detective barked. But the collector? He didn't move. He just smiled. And then, as the officers stepped forward, the lights flickered. The room seemed to stretch and shrink at the same time. The air turned ice cold, and in a single blink, the collector was gone. The last object. All that remained was the wooden box he had left behind. Reese and Richard stared at it, neither wanting to be the first to open it. The detective finally reached forward, flipping the latch. Inside, nestled in a bed of black velvet, was an old pocket watch, and behind the glass cover, the reflection of a man neither of them had ever seen before, watching, waiting, smiling. Detective Jonathan Reese stood frozen, staring at the pocket watch left on the table, his mind spinning with possibilities. The glass of the piece reflected the weak light from Richard Langston's shop, but the most unsettling thing of all was what was reflected in it. A man who shouldn't have been there. The same man who had vanished before their eyes just seconds earlier. Richard stood behind the counter, speechless, his body trembling. This doesn't make sense. His voice faltered. He was here, Detective. I saw him. Reese didn't answer right away. He was scanning every detail around him. Something wasn't right. The air felt heavy, as if time itself had slowed down. The shop's atmosphere seemed to be shifting, warping. The sound of the old music playing in the background suddenly stopped. The detective turned his gaze back to Richard. His eyes were empty, as if he had been pulled out of reality. Something was happening, something that went beyond a simple disappearance. "Richard?" Reese murmured, his gaze fixed on the watch, which now seemed to pulse with strange energy. "You know what's happening, don't you?" The antique dealer didn't respond. He only looked at the watch. His face, pale and tense, reflected what Reese already knew. The piece wasn't just an object, it was a symbol. The collector of memories wasn't just collecting objects, he was collecting lives. Erased memories, as if every item stolen took a piece of the human soul. Every disappearance was another fragment of humanity stored in his twisted collection. Richard finally spoke, his voice low and filled with dread. "He won't stop. He'll never stop." Reese looked at the watch once more. The reflection was clearer now, sharper. He could see the man, the collector, standing behind Richard, smiling as if feeding on his fear. It was as though he were watching, waiting to take the next one. Suddenly, everything clicked. The collector wasn't just taking the items from the victims. He was transforming each memory into an object, turning what should have been forgotten into something eternal. It was as if he was creating a file of souls, making people vanish from reality without leaving a trace, except for what he collected. Richard fell to his knees, his eyes watering. He had been complicit. He hadn't just sold the pieces, he had known. Every time the collector came, Richard felt that something was wrong, but he kept buying. For a reason he couldn't understand, he felt he had to, as if somehow he was part of something larger. Reese took a step back, his mind finally connecting all the dots. He looked around the shop. The walls now seemed to stretch, distorting, as if the very store was trying to swallow everything around them. "No," Reese murmured, his voice trembling. "He hasn't gone, has he?" Richard didn't respond. He simply looked at the watch again, and it was at that moment that Reese realized the worst of all the secrets. The collector wasn't after a simple object. He was after a successor. In the instant Richard looked at the watch, the mirror behind him flickered with a sinister gleam. Suddenly, the space around Reese seemed to collapse in on itself, and everything was consumed by absolute darkness. "Now you understand, Detective," the voice whispered, coming from all directions. It was the voice of the collector, but at the same time, it seemed to be that of everyone who had disappeared. The detective tried to scream, but his voice vanished, lost in the vast emptiness. The last sound he heard was the ticking of a clock, its rhythm echoing as he felt a cold hand touch his shoulder. And everything disappeared. Days later, Richard Langston's shop was found empty, the front door unlocked, the windows undisturbed. No signs of a struggle, no evidence that anything unusual had taken place. The shelves remained lined with their usual assortment of oddities, faded books, tarnished silverware, and delicate trinkets that whispered of forgotten lives. Yet something was different. On the counter, where customers once bartered for relics of the past, sat a single item, the pocket watch. It gleamed under the dim light, pristine as if untouched by time. And yet, those who had seen it before knew that it had not always been there. Or rather, it had. but not quite like this. The hands on its face had shifted, marking a new hour, a new moment, a new fate. Detective Jonathan Reese's name vanished from the police records, erased as if he had never existed. His case, once the subject of hushed speculation, dissolved into silence. No officers spoke of him, no witnesses recalled his visit to the shop, and if a memory did stir in the mind of an old colleague, it faded before it could take shape. Richard Langston was gone as well. No trace of him remained, no belongings left behind. His absence was like so many before him, those who had stepped too close to the mysteries of the shop, who had peered too deeply into the past and found themselves consumed by it. Yet the shop remained, unclaimed, yet untouched. It continued as it always had, its presence unshaken by the passage of time or the disappearance of its owner. A store without an owner, a store that seemed less like a business and more like a threshold, a portal to something beyond ordinary comprehension. Its shelves, once sparsely filled, now overflowed with even more curiosities. New artifacts, strange and alluring, waited for those who would come searching. The shop did not call to just anyone. Only those who were meant to find it would step through its doors, drawn by the whispers of history, by the weight of stories untold, and, who knows, perhaps you're the next one. Second story. On the evening of May 15th, 1997, a heavy rain poured down over the city of New Orleans. The streets were empty, except for a few cars speeding by, and the sound of raindrops hitting the roofs of the houses seemed muffled by the dense fog enveloping the city. The street lamps flickered intermittently, and the wind made the trees sway, casting shadows that danced along the sidewalks. Everything seemed to suggest a night like any other, until around 11:52 p.m., a mysterious call was received by the New Orleans Police Department. The woman on the other end of the line was out of breath, her voice trembling. She didn't give her name and seemed to hesitate, as if the weight of her words was suffocating her. He's not here anymore," she murmured, swallowing her words with a clear tone of panic. I can't leave. I can't." The voice abruptly went silent, and the line went dead. The call was recorded, but the police, unsure of what exactly was happening, decided to send a patrol unit to 312 Oak Street, a quiet area of the city. The neighborhood was the epitome of old New Orleans, wooden houses with flower-adorned porches, tree-lined streets, and an air of serenity that seemed disconnected from the everyday tensions. Nothing suggested that a night of terror was unfolding at that address. At 12:15 a.m., 2 officers arrived at the house. The scene at first glance was nothing out of the ordinary. The door was ajar, but nothing seemed out of place. There were no signs of forced entry, no sounds coming from inside the house. "Let's see what we have here," Officer Parker, a seasoned veteran of the force, said as he took his first step into the residence, lighting the way with his flashlight. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavy, as if time had stopped inside. The furniture was old, but well kept. The wall clock read exactly 2:15 a.m., and with each ticking sound, the sense of unease grew. The weak light from the flashlight illuminated the living room, revealing an open book on the coffee table. The book's cover was worn, but the page was turned to a peculiar Latin quote, "Tempus fugit," time flies. Detective Jonathan Reese, assigned to the case, arrived at the scene moments later, and a sense of discomfort took over him as soon as he set foot inside the house. Something was wrong. The atmosphere felt thick, oppressive. The walls seemed to pulse with the sound of the rain and the whispers of the wind. Reese searched the house thoroughly. There was something unusual about the painting hanging on the living room wall, an image of the Mississippi River, with a signature in fine print at the lower right corner, R. Langston. The name was unfamiliar, and there was no record of a Richard Langston connected to the area or the house. The detective wondered if the painting was a clue, but what bothered him most was the feeling that someone was watching him, even though he was alone in the room. He touched the frame. Upon contact, something vibrated, not physically, but in his perception. A strange feeling ran down his spine, as if the house itself was observing him. Hours passed, and the case began to unravel. No woman was found, and the phone line that had received the call offered no more answers. The following morning, what began as a simple investigation into a woman's disappearance had turned into a case without explanation. The lack of any physical trace, any solid evidence, began to consume the investigating team. As the days went by, the house remained uninhabited, but not inert. Various officers, including Detective Reese, reported strange phenomena. Some claimed to hear whispers at night. Others said they saw shadows moving across the windows, even when no one was inside. The ticking of the clock, which had been stopped at 2:15 a.m., echoed in the minds of the investigators, but no one dared to question its meaning. In the early hours of June 22, 1997, more than a month after the disappearance, an even more disturbing event occurred. Detective Jonathan Reese's name disappeared from the department's official records. He was no longer listed as part of the team, and his files had been archived as if he had never existed. The case of 312 Oak Street was left aside, as if an invisible force had erased any trace of it. While the city of New Orleans tried to carry on with its routine, rumors began to spread. Some people started to speak of the house on Oak Street, suggesting that it was not just a house, but a portal. A point of connection between the real world and something else. Something dark and unknown. And so, as a shadow creeping through the night, the mystery of 312 Oak Street faded from the collective consciousness of the city. The wall clock, still frozen at 2:15, waited. The painting of Langston, with its enigmatic signature, remained untouched. But who knows? Perhaps you are the next person to cross the path of Oak Street. Perhaps as you turn the corner on some rainy day, your eyes will fall upon the silent house, and you will feel the pull, the call to unravel a secret that should have remained buried. But then the inevitable question arises. Would you dare enter? It was a cloudy morning in July when the case of 312 Oak Street was officially reopened. After weeks with no progress, Captain Malone, under increasing pressure from the media and growing questions about missing officers like Detective Reese, decided to put a new team on the case. They arrived with the intent to follow the path that hadn't been explored. But something was different. Detective Olivia Grant, a meticulous woman with a sharp eye, took charge of the investigation. She never believed in fantasies. To her, everything had a logical explanation, and she was confident that this story had a thread hidden in the shadows that could be unraveled. But soon, she would discover that some truths are deeper than the human mind can comprehend. During her first visit to the house, she was accompanied by Field Agent Jake Richardson, a skeptical and pragmatic man who soon noticed the same discomfort that the other investigators had reported. The atmosphere was heavy, as though the house were alive, breathing. They moved into the main room, where the book and the painting were still in place. The only thing different was the clock, now broken on the floor, with its hands still pointing to exactly 2:15. Something was about to happen. Grant looked more closely at the painting of the Mississippi River. There was something unsettling about it. The name R. Langston still haunted her, like a shadow over the investigation. But the real shock came when she lifted the painting to examine the back. Behind the canvas, something was hidden, a series of enigmatic symbols, etched in such detail that it seemed they had been made with blood. With a lump in her throat, she turned to Richardson. "This isn't normal. We need to find Langston. Now." The investigation into the record office revealed that Richard Langston had disappeared over 20 years ago, with no trace left behind. His name was listed under several old properties in New Orleans, including a small antique shop on Bourbon Street, which had been mysteriously closed. But the most disturbing information was that Langston had been a collector of rare items, many of which were said to have occult origins and stories that were lost to time. Grant and Richardson visited the shop on Bourbon Street, and what they found there was even stranger. The shop, which seemed to have been abandoned, was intact. Wooden shelves lined with old objects filled the room, each item covered in a thin layer of dust. But there was one item in particular that caught their attention: a pocket watch, exactly like the one found at the Oak Street house. The same model, the same aged shine, but with a peculiar detail. The watch was stopped at the same time, 2:15. "This can't be a coincidence," Grant said, her voice now firm. "The watches, they're connected somehow." They investigated further, finding more items related to Langston in his shop: old books, artifacts, and a wooden box with a symbol identical to the one behind the painting at the house. When Grant opened the box, a wave of cold washed over her. Inside the box was an aged letter, handwritten, with words that seemed like a warning. "To those who dare to follow this path, time is not what it seems. The watch is only a key. You are about to see what should not be seen. The hour has come." As Grant read the letter, a sense of terror took over her, as though an invisible force was closing in. When she looked out the shop window, she saw a shadow pass quickly. But when she turned to Richardson, he was staring intently at the watch. His eyes were empty, as if he had been hypnotized by something beyond human understanding. "Jake! Jake!" Grant shouted, but he didn't respond. She ran to him, trying to pull him away, but something stopped her. The watch, with its hands now moving slowly, seemed to draw all of Richardson's attention, and he was completely paralyzed. It was then that Grant's phone rang. "Detective Grant?" A familiar voice, but laden with urgency, came from the other side. It was Captain Malone. "You need to come back to Oak Street. Something's happening." Before she could respond, the line went dead, and then the ground trembled. Something was happening, something that even Grant's logic couldn't explain. She left Richardson at the shop, hesitant, but knowing that the only solution would be to return to the house on Oak Street. The feeling that something terrible was coming made her quicken her pace. With each passing second, the fear grew. The house was calling. The clock was ticking. As she neared the house, a thick fog rose from the street, enveloping everything around her. When she reached the door, she found it ajar. The lights were off, but something was glowing inside, reflecting the streetlight. She entered, and as she crossed the hallway, an unmistakable sound began to echo. It was the sound of a clock. Tick-tock, tick-tock, exactly at 2:15. Grant knew that the truth was about to be revealed, but she also knew that when the mystery was unraveled, nothing would ever be the same again. Olivia Grant stepped into the house on Oak Street with her heart pounding, her senses on edge with every shadow that moved. The atmosphere was heavy, as if the house itself were breathing, as if it were being watched by something beyond reality. The walls creaked, and the echo of the clock seemed to fill the space in a nearly physical way, like a silent presence, patiently waiting to reveal its secret. The sound of the ticking, loud and relentless, reverberated in her mind, beating like a drum against her consciousness. She moved down the dark hallway, each step sounding heavy on the creaking wooden floor. As she approached the main room, the sensation of being watched intensified. The portrait of Langston, still hanging on the wall, looked more vivid than ever. The sky in the landscape behind Langston, once dark and lifeless, now seemed to pulse with a golden light, as if a storm were brewing. It was impossible to ignore the sense that something was about to happen. something big. She entered the room, and the first thing she noticed was the pocket watch. It was on the coffee table, exactly where she had left it. But as she looked at it, Olivia felt a chill run down her spine. The watch was different. It wasn't just the same model. There was something wrong about it. The metallic surface, which had previously seemed aged, now gleamed, almost polished, as if it had been freshly made. The most disturbing thing, though, was the hands. They were stopped, but not at a normal time. They were pointing exactly to 2:15. She couldn't explain why this bothered her so much, but the simple fact that it was there, so perfect and still, seemed like a challenge. Olivia hesitated for a moment before noticing a stack of papers next to the watch. She picked them up and with trembling hands began to flip through them. They were Langston's writings. The handwriting was perfect, but the words seemed to distort as she read. "I discovered the secret," the first page said. "Time is a prison. The key to freedom lies in control. The watch doesn't just mark the hours, it traps us within them. I saw the door. I saw what lies on the other side. There is no turning back." She quickly flipped to the next page, but her eyes couldn't believe what they read. "Time is an illusion that consumes me. By trying to control it, I've become part of it. When the hour comes, so will you. All of us, part of the cycle. The watch calls us. The hour never passes." A sense of despair enveloped her. Langston hadn't just been obsessed with time, he had imprisoned it, becoming part of it. And now he was trying to force others to do the same. She knew there was something more behind this mystery, something darker than anyone could imagine. But before she could process everything, the air around her became heavier, denser. The watch, motionless on the table, began to make a low sound, almost imperceptible, as if it were preparing for something huge. The ticking had intensified to the point that it now seemed to be the only thing left in her reality. Time was freezing, and with a sudden snap, the watch began to move again, the hands slowly turning as if it had been awakened from a long slumber. That's when she heard the scream. It wasn't a human scream. It was a deep sound, an echo of something ancient, something from another world. A voice that seemed to come from within the walls, from deep inside the earth. Olivia turned to the painting and something indescribable happened. The clouds in the picture began to move, to stir, as if they were gaining life. And then, in a smooth motion, they opened up, revealing a bright light, blinding, a light that seemed to pull everything toward it. She was unable to move, as if she were being drawn into the canvas, into that storm. Olivia tried to scream, but her voice was lost in the vastness of what surrounded her. The portrait of Langston distorted, his eyes in the painting now staring directly at her, as if he were calling her. The light from the painting grew stronger, and she felt herself being absorbed, swallowed by something that didn't belong to this world. Time seemed to be tearing apart. There was no more hour, no more space. There was only that light and the growing sensation that she was becoming part of something bigger, something beyond comprehension. She tried to take a step back, but her body wouldn't respond. Her feet felt heavy, immersed in an invisible substance, as if time itself were closing in on her, trapping her in that moment. The watch stopped again, but the sound continued. The sound of the truth. The sound of something no one could understand. It was then that she heard a voice, familiar but full of pain and suffering. "You don't understand, Olivia. You will never understand." It was Jake Richardson's voice, the partner she had left behind, the one she had left at the Bourbon Street shop. But he wasn't there anymore. Not as he was. He was inside the watch, inside the cycle. Now part of what he had once been. The time hadn't let him disappear. He had become a part of the machine. Olivia looked at him, but he wasn't Jake anymore. He was a shadow, a distorted reflection, part of the temporal flow. And he was losing his identity, losing everything he had been. And in one final gasp, he dissolved into the light of the painting, becoming part of the mystery, part of the endless cycle. Slowly, Olivia felt excruciating pain, as if every part of her being was being undone, every moment of her life becoming irrelevant, lost in time. The watch, the cycle that never breaks. She was now part of it. But just before everything faded, Olivia had a final revelation. She looked at the hands of the watch, which were now again pointing to 2:15, and understood. She wasn't being trapped by an entity. She was being absorbed by time itself. The cycle never ended. Olivia Grant didn't disappear. She became part of the watch itself, part of the mystery that would now be passed on to anyone daring enough to enter. Because in the end, the cycle never ends, and the watch, with its incessant ticking, will continue to call. And when someone, years from now, looks at the house on Oak Street, they will see the watch frozen at the same hour, waiting, as it has always been, as it always will be, because time never passes, the cycle never breaks, and no one escapes. Now, let's move on to the next story. November 14th, 1997, Coldwater, Michigan, 3:32 a.m. The police cruiser glided slowly down the deserted road, its headlights cutting through the thick fog of the early morning. The radio crackled with static before a hesitant voice came through. Possible break-in, abandoned house, Black Hollow Road, number 16. Officer Daniel Mercer narrowed his eyes at the address, Black Hollow Road. Everyone in the small town of Coldwater knew that street, and everyone knew that no one should go near number 16. It was an old house, left to rot for decades. In 1955, the Holloway family vanished there without a trace. An intense investigation followed, but no bodies were ever found. The house was sealed off, but that didn't stop the rumors. They said that at 2:15 a.m., lights could still be seen flickering through the windows. They said doors slammed shut on their own. They said no one left the house the same as they entered. Mercer sighed, exchanging a glance with his partner, young officer Luke Harris. Harris looked tense, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "Black Hollow Road, huh?" Mercer muttered. Harris swallowed hard and nodded. "You ever heard the stories?" "I've heard them," Mercer replied. "But stories don't solve cases. Let's find out what's really going on." When they arrived at the address, they turned off the siren and scanned the area. The two-story house loomed before them, dark and imposing. The upper windows reflected the pale moon, giving the eerie illusion of empty eyes watching the street. The wooden fence surrounding the property was broken in several places, and the front door, which should have been locked for years, was slightly open. Mercer grabbed his flashlight and stepped out of the car, Harris following close behind. "If someone's in there, they're trespassing," Harris said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. Mercer tested the doorknob and pushed the door open. It creaked, revealing a long, dark hallway. The air smelled of damp wood and dust. At the end of the corridor, a motionless grandfather clock displayed a frozen time, 2:15 a.m. Harris shined his flashlight on the walls. The floral wallpaper was peeling away, revealing something underneath. Deep scratches, as if someone had desperately tried to claw their way out. "An animal did this?" Harris asked. Mercer crouched down to examine the gouges in the wood. If it was an animal, it had human fingernails. Then a sound echoed from upstairs. Footsteps. Someone was there. Mercer and Harris exchanged looks before drawing their weapons. "Coldwater Police," Mercer called out. "If someone's up there, come out with your hands up." No response, only silence. And then, slowly, the door at the top of the stairs began to creak open. The door at the top of the stairs creaked open, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. Mercer took a deep breath, gripping his gun tighter. Harris hesitated for a moment, his flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. "You hear that?" Harris whispered. Mercer nodded. A faint shuffling noise came from inside the room, like someone moving cautiously. The two officers climbed the stairs, each step creaking under their weight. The old wood felt brittle, as if it might collapse beneath them. The closer they got to the open doorway, the colder the air became. As they reached the top, Mercer raised his flashlight and gun, stepping inside first. The room was small, dust-covered, with an old iron bed frame against the wall. The mattress was torn open, stuffing spilling out like intestines. A child's rocking horse sat in the corner, its wooden body cracked with age. But the most disturbing thing was the writing on the walls. Hundreds of words carved into the plaster with what looked like fingernails. "He comes at 2:15. Again and again, over and over, the same phrase. Harris exhaled sharply. "What the hell is this?" Mercer knelt down, examining the scratches. "This isn't fresh. These markings have been here for years." Suddenly, a loud thud echoed from downstairs. Both men spun toward the staircase, weapons ready. "Who's there?" Mercer called out. No answer, only the sound of something moving, slow, deliberate. Harris swallowed hard. "Maybe we should call for backup." Mercer reached for his radio, but as he pressed the button, all he heard was static. The temperature in the room dropped further, and their breaths became visible in the dim light. Then came another sound, a child's laughter. Soft, distant, but undeniably real. Harris took a step back, shaking his head. "Number? No way. I don't like this, Mercer. I really don't like this." Mercer didn't respond. He was staring at the old wooden closet at the far end of the room. It was slightly ajar, and something was scratching inside, a slow, rhythmic scraping against the wood. Mercer took a cautious step forward and reached for the door handle. With a sharp pull, he swung it open, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Nothing. Just old coats hanging from a rusted metal rod. Then, from below them, the grandfather clock began to chime. Dong, dong, dong. Mercer and Harris exchanged a glance. "That clock was dead when we got here," Harris whispered. The chimes continued, slow and deliberate. Then, at the final dong, it stopped. 2:15 a.m. And then, everything changed. The bedroom door slammed shut behind them with such force that dust rained down from the ceiling. The flashlight in Harris's hand flickered wildly before going out completely. Mercer's breath hitched as he felt something shift in the air, like a presence in the room, watching. Then came the whisper, soft, rasping, just inches from Mercer's ear. "Run!" Mercer spun around, but the room was empty. His pulse thundered in his ears as he grabbed the doorknob and twisted. Locked. "Harris, help me!" he shouted. Harris fumbled with the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The air grew even colder, so cold that Mercer could see frost forming along the window panes. Then, a new sound. The closet door, the one Mercer had just opened, began to creak shut on its own, and the scratching returned. This time, it was louder, faster, desperate. Mercer's instincts screamed at him to get out, to leave now. He raised his gun, aiming at the closet door. "Whoever's in there, come out now." The scratching stopped, and then, slowly, painfully, the closet door began to open again. A smell filled the room, rot, decay, death. Harris gagged, stepping back. "Oh, God!" Something moved inside the closet, something small. A figure emerged, a little girl, no older than 6. Her dress was tattered, her skin ashen, her hair matted, but her eyes, they were hollow, black pits, empty and lifeless. She lifted a small skeletal hand and pointed at Mercer. Then, in a voice that wasn't hers, she spoke. "He's here." The lights flickered. The floor beneath them shook, and behind them, from the darkness of the room, heavy footsteps. The footsteps behind them were slow, deliberate, heavy. Each step sent a deep vibration through the floorboards, as if the house itself was reacting to its presence. Mercer and Harris spun around, guns raised, but their flashlights flickered and died, plunging them into near-total darkness. The only illumination came from the moonlight filtering through the cracked window. The little girl stood motionless by the closet, her hollow eyes fixed on Mercer. And then she smiled, a wide, unnatural grin that split her pale lips too far apart. Harris took a shaky step back. "We need to get out of here, now." Before Mercer could respond, the entire room shifted. The walls stretched, warping and groaning like a living thing. The window glass cracked, the floorboards trembled, and an unseen force slammed them both against the wall. Mercer gasped as an invisible pressure crushed his chest, pinning him in place. He could hear Harris struggling beside him, wheezing as he fought against the unseen grip. And then, from the darkness of the room, it emerged. A tall, emaciated figure, its form shrouded in flickering shadows. Its limbs were too long, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. Its eyes, if they could be called that, were nothing but deep, gaping voids. And it was smiling. The thing stepped forward, its bare feet making no sound against the wooden floor. Its head twitched with each movement, as if adjusting to see them more clearly. Mercer tried to move, but the pressure against his chest was unbearable. His vision blurred, his lungs burned. Then, the thing spoke. Its voice was a deep, gurgling whisper, layered with the echoes of 100 voices speaking at once. "Time has come." Harris let out a strangled cry, his body convulsing violently against the wall. His eyes rolled back, his mouth opened in a silent scream. And then, he vanished. Not like someone being pulled away, not like something snatching him into the darkness. Harris simply ceased to exist. Mercer's breath hitched. His partner was gone, not dead, not unconscious, erased. Panic surged through Mercer as he thrashed against the invisible force, his mind racing. No one had ever returned from Black Hollow Road. No one had ever escaped the house. And now he knew why. The thing took another step closer, extending one impossibly long hand toward Mercer. Its fingers, jagged, bony, brushed against his cheek, sending an unbearable cold through his veins. Memories flooded his mind, not his own. He saw the Holloway family, sitting at their dinner table, their faces twisted in silent horror, unable to scream as the thing stood among them. He saw the other victims, officers, trespassers, curious souls who had wandered in and never left. Their faces, blurred, erased, as if they had never existed. And then he saw himself, not in the present, but before he had even entered the house. A man in the shadows, standing just beyond the tree line, watching. The realization hit him like a freight train. This was always meant to happen. The house didn't just trap people, it rewrote reality. No one outside would remember Luke Harris. His name would be erased from records, his life wiped from existence as if he had never been born. And Mercer? Mercer had already been here before. He had always been here. The creature leaned in, its voice a whisper of finality. 2:15. Time resets. And then, blackness. No pain, no struggle. Just an empty void where Daniel Mercer once existed. November 14th, 1997, Coldwater, Michigan. 3:32 a.m. A police cruiser rolled slowly down Black Hollow Road. The radio crackled. Possible break-in, house abandoned. Black Hollow Road, number 16. Officer David Carter narrowed his eyes at the address. His partner, Officer James Monroe, tensed beside him. Black Hollow Road, huh? Monroe muttered. Carter sighed. Let's see what's going on. The car pulled up to the house. The front door was slightly open, and inside, The grandfather clock remained frozen at 2:15 a.m. If you're still awake, let's go for another story. Thank you to everyone who listened this far. If you're new to the channel, subscribe and like the video to receive notifications when we post. Let's go. The Texas Hill Country stretched endlessly under the dim glow of the moon, a vast and desolate land where the nearest town, Raven Hill, barely held a population of 600 souls. The Carter Ranch sat deep in this isolation, nestled at the end of a winding dirt road nearly 10 kilometers from the main highway. James and Laura Carter had chosen the property for its remoteness, drawn by the quiet and the sense of escape it offered from their old lives in Dallas. They wanted peace. What they got was something else entirely. That November night, the wind howled against the old wooden house, rattling the porch swing with an eerie creak. James stood on the front steps, lighting a cigarette, his breath visible in the cold air. The land stretched before him, open fields dissolving into a dense line of trees. Beyond that, nothing but darkness. He took a slow drag, scanning the horizon. Something felt different tonight. Inside, Laura rinsed the last of the dishes, humming softly. The kitchen window was fogged from the warmth inside, distorting the shapes of the barren landscape beyond. Then Buck, their German shepherd, let out a low growl from the back door. She wiped her hands on a dish towel. "What is it, boy?" The dog's ears were pinned back, his eyes fixed on the black void outside. His growl deepened, turning into a furious bark. Laura felt a prickle of unease. Buck wasn't the type to bark at nothing. James heard it too. He flicked his cigarette into the dirt and stepped inside, grabbing the shotgun from the wall. He was used to the occasional coyote or bobcat wandering too close to the house. Still, something about the way Buck was acting put him on edge. He unbolted the back door and swung it open, flooding the yard with light from the porch. The fields were empty. The only movement was the brittle grass swaying in the wind. He exhaled, lowering the shotgun. Then he saw them. Footprints, fresh ones, leading from the fence toward the house, single file. But there were no prints leading away. James felt his pulse quicken. He turned back to Laura. "Someone's been here." Laura stepped closer, peering over his shoulder. "But where did they go?" Then, the sound. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the kitchen window. Laura spun around with a sharp gasp. Outside the glass, barely visible in the dim porch light, stood a man. His face was obscured beneath a burlap sack. He didn't move, didn't shift, just stood there, watching. James raised the shotgun. "Hey, you're trespassing. I'll blow your damn head off." The figure didn't react. Then, as if obeying some unseen command, his head tilted ever so slightly to the side, and then he was gone. Not ran, not stepped away, just gone. James stormed out the front door, scanning the yard. Nothing but silence. No wind, no crickets. Even Buck had gone quiet, his tail between his legs. Laura locked the doors, her hands trembling as she grabbed the landline. No signal. That wasn't unusual out here, but the timing felt wrong. Then came another noise, a click from the back door. They turned in unison. The lock had slid open. James raised the shotgun. He moved carefully toward the door and nudged it open with the barrel. The cold night air seeped in. The kitchen was empty. The yard beyond was empty. But something felt different. Office Buck bolted into the darkness with a snarl. Then, a yelp. A terrible, choked-off whimper. Then silence. James took a step onto the porch, his breath hitching. "Buck?" The night swallowed his voice. Then Laura grabbed his arm, her nails digging into his skin. She was looking at something behind him. James turned slowly. At the far end of the property, just beyond the barn, stood another figure, identical to the first. Same dark clothes, same burlap sack, standing perfectly still, watching. And then James noticed something else. There were more of them, 2, 5, 8, standing in a loose semicircle just at the edge of the darkness, unmoving. And then, as one, they all took a single step forward. James grabbed Laura's wrist and pulled her toward the truck. His hands fumbled with the keys. He shoved one into the ignition. The engine wouldn't start. Laura was hyperventilating. "James!" He twisted the key again. Nothing. The figures were closer now, silent, surrounding the house. And then, one of them held something up. James's stomach turned to ice. It was Buck. The dog's limp body dangled from the figure's grasp, head lolling unnaturally to the side. The burlap-masked figure dropped it to the ground like discarded trash. James fired the shotgun through the windshield. The figures did not flinch. Then, darkness. Everything went black. James woke up first. He was lying on the dirt, his head pounding. The sun was rising. Laura was gone. The truck was gone. The house, empty. Only one thing remained, a neatly folded burlap sack on the porch. Inside, a handwritten note. "Now she is one of us." James was never seen again. And to this day, on the back roads of Raven Hill, people swear they still see them, standing along the tree line, their burlap faces turned toward the road, waiting. And if you stop, they take one step closer. Now, the last. On a cold winter night in Oklahoma, Sarah, a young receptionist, worked at a secluded motel called the Roadside Refuge. One rainy night, the phone rang and a low voice whispered, "I'm in room 13. I need help." Sarah rushed to the room, but when she tried to unlock the door, it wouldn't budge. Inside, the room was empty, but the voice whispered, "You shouldn't have come here." Suddenly, the door slammed shut, trapping her inside. When she turned to the mirror, a pale woman with dark eyes stared back at her and stepped out of the glass. "Now, you're one of us," she whispered. The next morning, Sarah was gone. The room was empty, except for bloodstains on the wall and the intact mirror. Some say on rainy nights, the phone still rings at the motel. If you answer. Thank you for being here at Echoes of Fear, where every story is crafted to send chills down, even the bravest spines. Your support means the world to us, and knowing that you're here, listening to every dark tale, motivates us to keep bringing more mysteries, suspense, and terror to this channel. With each new video, we dive deep into stories that challenge reality, explore the unknown, and bring forth the most disturbing nightmares. And all of this only makes sense because you are here to listen. So thank you for taking the time to follow our content and embark on these terrifying journeys with us. If you enjoyed today's story, don't forget to leave a like. It helps us continue bringing you more spine-chilling tales. Leave a comment with your thoughts, share it with someone who loves horror, and if you haven't yet, subscribe to the channel so you never miss another terrifying story. Turn on notifications to be the first to know when we post something new. But be careful, not all stories are just stories. We'll see you in the next video, if you're still here.